export it. So let's get this thing recording, and so we'll get started here. So David, one of the questions I sent to you earlier, it was one of my questions, and let's talk about it for a moment because it's something I encountered and I didn't even realize it was there. And Dave, what happened to us in our production environment is we moved to a new server of course, it was on VMware, and we started getting a frozen IO for about 30 seconds and then a resume IO in our error log. And it happened one morning right about 8 o'clock during the morning and took our website for about 30 seconds down. So what's going on there? What's happening?
This is a very, very common thing, and this is actually one of the reasons I started my own company. I call it, the tagline is kind of the convergence of infrastructure and data. And this is where what a really good idea from a VM admin perspective it does when it's not a good idea for the DBAs. And it's kind of tough. So here's what's going on. The VM admin has configured that VM to be backed up from a VM level, not an in-guest agent like we're all kind of used to from the past. What that does, if there's usually a little checkbox that says, I want to make this application consistent. The challenge there is whenever that option is checked, and name your flavor of VM level backup. I mean, backup exec, Commvault, Veeam, all these things, they all can do this. That command is sent into Windows to essentially say, flush everything that needs to be written to disk, and it issues a VSS file system quiesce command. As a result, Windows says, I'm going to suspend I/O in SQL Server for a very brief moment in time, and anything that's in flight, I'm going to flush to disk. Problem is, the more databases you have, the more activity you have, the longer this can take. And it's tough because the database server essentially is just suspended while this happens. Normally what you get is half a second, quarter of a second. It usually doesn't make that big of a deal. But if something's not right in the environment or you got a lot of activity, it can actually take longer and longer and longer. And during that time, you're offline. It doesn't break SQL Server directly, but if your app is sitting there trying to run, it's not going to get anything back. You may actually hit timeouts and it might start throwing errors. So if you see this, go to the infrastructure team and say, I'm getting VSS quiesce commands that are flushing I/O to disk and it's stopping my database server. Please remove the application-aware components from your VM level backup. I'll take care of the database level backups just like we normally do, regular database and backups and transaction log maintenance. And then that will actually fix that.
Yeah, it sounds good because it definitely shut our website down, and it was long enough that we were getting timeouts. So it was not a pretty picture because my product guy comes to me about an hour later and says, "Hey, what's going on with the SQL Server?" And I started looking around and saw that. So it's something to definitely. The other thing is be sure and look at your error log every day because sometimes as being a lone DBA you get busy or whatever, and I'm like going, who's got time to look at the error log? But it taught me a lesson to go back and make sure that I'm paying attention to that error log. So
Got to do it.
got to do it, yeah, because it's one of those things that's got to start the morning. That's kind of like your coffee. Go look at it and see what's going on.
And morning
So
routine, Windows error logs, infrastructure error logs if you've got that kind of visibility, and then database error logs.
yeah.
And specifically anything with I/O frozen, or anytime you see lots of the long I/O alerts, this I/O has taken more than 15 seconds, try to put all that together and see what else is going on at that same time. Because if it's a VM, it may not be in your machine. It may be something in the background that's just eating all the I/O on that host or on the SAN.
Yeah. So definitely pay attention to that because it can bite you. So, all right. Here's some questions we have for you. Is there any guidance in configuring CPU on VM guest which has SQL to match with host physical server? Is there any VM performance counters that are available on VM guest to troubleshoot performance issues related? That's question number 2 to VM. And question 3 is what threshold values we should look for in VM vSphere client for CPU, memory, and I/O. So David, I'll copy that in because that's a lot.
That is. Let's start with the first one there. And so essentially, what do we need to do to make sure that the VM itself is lined up from a CPU perspective with the physical machine? And that's a really, really good question. It's one that's going to take a moment to show. So can you make me the presenter again? And
Sure
my
will.
home lab is actually just coming alive after the move. So we just got settled about a week ago, actually. But can you see my screen okay?
I've got it.
Okay. So great question. So now let's talk physical machine. What if, in this case, these are a little bit older HP ProLiant, they're DL380 G6s. So it's a dual socket 4-core machine. So I got 8 total physical cores. Now I have the option hyperthreading's turned on. If I go right click create new VM, I can set up to 16 CPUs on that VM. The interesting thing here is if I just set it by default, it's going to give me a VM with 16 virtual sockets, each with 1 virtual CPU. And what that tells the hypervisor is that it's okay to kind of jumble everything around. And that's good and it's bad. Well, let me do a quick diagram here. And 1 second. There we go. Okay, if you can see this, this is going to be a really horrible drawing, but on the physical machine, this can be CPU socket 1, CPU socket 2. Now, a while back, there's this thing called NUMA out there, where they basically, said I got 2 CPUs, I got a whole bunch of RAM, and after a while, that thing that connected the two started to run slow. It just couldn't keep up with the densities that are out there. So AMD started it, Intel perfected it, and you've got now where they actually put memory next to each physical CPU socket. So the green here is the RAM. This is a really horrible diagram, I apologize. But essentially what you get is memory that is local to each one of the CPU. There we go. And now this CPU can access the memory from the other machine, but in terms of physics, it's actually about 3 times longer, give or take, depending on the architecture, to actually fetch memory from the other. So what they did was they extended the awareness of this grouping into the physical machine, into the operating system. They call it NUMA. So this is NUMA node 0, that collection of RAM and CPU, and the NUMA node 1 is on the other side. Well, that's how we can start to take advantage of the physical machine. SQL Server is really, really NUMA aware. So if I've got 16 virtual sockets, I could be fetching memory off the other NUMA node all day long, and it will slow it down. And it's really transparent to the VM, which is not good. What I can start to do, in fact, let me just shut this down and I'll show you. This is just another SQL Server I was building a couple days ago, actually. What I can do is I can build the VM to match the physical machine architecture. So in this case, if I want 8 CPUs on this VM, right there. So originally I had it set for 2 by 2, so 4. I can now match that physical machine. I can go 2 virtual sockets, each with 4 virtual cores. I can match the 8. Now that I've got this here, it'll actually extend this into the VM and you get a little bit better performance, usually. You got to measure it, but usually it's there. Now, one little gotcha, you got to figure out what's going on with the physical machine. You need to know, what CPU configuration you've got. So work with your infrastructure team on that. They should be happy to tell you. The other thing is VMware and Hyper-V both, by default, do not extend NUMA until you hit 9 or more vCPUs, and that's not good. So if you're looking at the screen here, what we can do is we can actually click on Options, Advanced General, and it's under the Advanced Configuration. But there's this parameter here that we can add called numa.vcpu.min 8. So instead of having that threshold at 8, we can make that, or instead of the default at 8, we can actually force it a little bit lower down to 8. So now, at that configuration, NUMA is actually going to make it into that SQL Server. And I can show you this right here. This will come up in just a moment, and I can show you. So what you do, if you can tailor this VM to that physical machine, it's going to cut down on the CPU contention. It's going to improve the performance, and it makes a big difference. Tom, anything you want to add there?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. I think you do a good job of kind of explaining that there.
Cool. Okay, so that's question one. Question two, are there any VM perfmon counters that are available inside the guest? And the answer is yes. So there's actually something I'm going to show here. And I don't want to mark it at all, but there's free knowledge out on my website. If you go out to heraflex.com, knowledge how-to guides, right here, Windows Perfmon Data Collector Guide. It's a PDF. I don't ask for emails or anything. It basically shows you how to set up Windows Perfmon to go collect data. And if you've got a third-party utility, SQL Sentry, SolarWinds, whatever, they all work kind of similar. You still get the same set of counters. So the counters here, if it's a VMware VM, then you do have two that are added, VM memory, so memory active, memory balloon swapped and used, and processor, percent processor time, effective VM speed, and host processor speed. If it's Hyper-V, you've got a bunch here. You've got health, you've got proc, memory, networking, and storage. And these are all really, really good ones to add if you're monitoring anything.
Nice. I did not realize you had that up there. So not a problem. Not a problem. Doing the free training, you get a little bit of marketing there. And then I sent you the third one in your chat window there. So if you can pop the chat instead of me trying to read them to you, maybe.
Yeah. So what are the values or thresholds that we should look for in terms of CPU, memory, and I/O issues? Boy, that's a good one. It's going to be a bit long-winded, kind of like the others, so apologize there, but there's a bunch. You got two layers. You have some at the physical machine and some at the VM. The physical machine, there's a couple of easy ones. One, look at the CPU usage. If we're way off the charts, that's not good. Memory, if we're in the yellow, stop adding VMs. If you're in the red, you probably have memory contention. You have memory pressure. That's not good. It means the VM layer might be trying to steal memory from some of the VMs in order to stay running or to give to other VMs. Not good. So performance-wise, or go ahead.
And something to note there to make sure that if they're in vSphere, make sure you're clicked on the host to look what he's showing you right now, not on the guest machines.
Yeah, and with SCOM and Hyper-V and SCVBM, the same rules apply. You've got all this through SCOM, and all the same counters are there. Essentially CPU. Are we off the charts? Do we have some of these that are maxed out? It's kind of interesting. One of the other things here, if you have a host, you can do stat graph per VM, which is kind of cool. You can actually see which VMs are consuming all the resources. It's like right here, this one. The Virtual Center VM was consuming a whole lot more CPU than anything else, and you can see it real quick. It's pretty cool. So just it's quick glance, but it's easy to read, it's easy to see, it's color coded. It's awesome.
And that's why, and then folks, that's why you should have access to vSphere if you don't have access.
Yep.
Go beat up your admin and say, negotiate, go buy him a beer, whatever you have to do to get this access.
Yeah, if you hit davidklee.net, my home lab, I've actually got 2 different blog posts there talking about the different talking points for you in order to go get access. In my opinion, if it's virtual, and it should be virtual, you need access to these consoles. You just have to have it. You don't need the ability to change anything, but you need the ability to get in and see what's going on, because it does make it makes a big difference. It makes you a better DBA. From a storage perspective, what you want to look for is latency. Now, we're all used to traditional SAN lines, so what we've got here, they actually call them data stores on the hypervisor, and all it is just a mapped LUN. So you can see here, I had an I/O latency spike up to 300 milliseconds, and again, this is, it's low-scale storage, so kind of expect it here, but that kind of a spike might have caused an impact to one of your SQL servers. So if you can see this from the physical machine layer, you can correlate it with what Windows and SQL Server are seeing and get a little bit better picture on what's going on. Now this one, I don't have throughput on here, but IOPS, throughput, and latency, they're the three big areas. I claim latency matters the most. IOPS matters second. Throughput is essentially IOPS times block size, so it matters, but not as much as the others. Let's see, disk doesn't really show up too much. That's just local on this one. Memory, this is an interesting one. The active memory is memory that has been touched, either read to or written from, or read from or written to on that host in that polling interval. In this case, it's 20 seconds. This is almost a useless counter. So anybody that's using these counters to tell you that you need less memory inside your SQL Server, just ignore them. Actually, hit my blog. I've got something from VMware directly, a public doc actually, that says if you're running SQL Server on VMware, completely ignore this counter. It's useless.
Yeah, I actually had someone tell me one time that they had their VM admin wanted to bring all their memory down to what the active memory said. I was like going, yeah, go right ahead and shut your SQL Server down.
Yeah, it's bad. If you go to my home blog, do a search for memory counters lie. It's essentially the active memory counter. Yeah, right here. Pull that up. Yeah, memory counters lie. That doc right here, SQL Server on VMware best practices, and this directly applies to Hyper-V as well. The active memory counter should be used with caution. Blah, 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 blah. Therefore, I say don't even look at it. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how many VM admins don't realize that too. So that's the other thing is you have to help just educate them also with SQL running on there, especially
Well, yeah,
if they're new to it.
Yeah, that's the hardest part. VM admins know the infrastructure well, but they generally don't know SQL Server. And, the flip side of that is most DBAs generally don't have a strong background in infrastructure. So putting these two together creates some challenges. What works best for one may not work well for the other. It goes back to the original question of the day.
And Peter Shore come up with and said there is a good use of active memory counter. If the memory counter is high, if you see it high, you might have memory pressure issues going on. So
that is very true. Yeah, good call, Peter. Essentially, if the active memory counter is high, it might mean that you don't have enough RAM allocated to that VM, and there's not enough that's actually being cached in the SQL Server buffer pool.
Yep.
So. Yeah. It's interesting. Now, random stuff. I love looking at this. This host running all those VMs is using less power than the light bulbs in my kitchen.
Nice.
It's kind of cool.
Is that one of those old incandescent light bulbs, or is that an LED or CFL light bulb?
I've got 6 LEDs, but I think altogether they burned about a little bit more than that.
Ah, okay.
So not too bad. So that's most of the host level ones there. From a VM level, let's just pick DB01 here. The big stuff here, go back to performance. So CPU, you've got this. And this is actually going to answer another question that somebody asked, through email. CPU, we can see this thing has got 8 CPU cores, and that's really idle right now. But the CPU scheduling contention in here can get a little interesting. Every single thing in a VM has to be scheduled, so CPU, memory, network, and disk. It goes into these queues at each one of the hypervisors, and then it has to kind of wait its turn to get access to the physical machine resource. If there's not a lot going on, it can get through that pretty quickly. But if there's a lot going on, or if the NUMA configuration is just wrong, it might have to wait longer. So VMware calls it ready, Hyper-V calls it wait time per dispatch. But we can click on it and we can go see what that CPU scheduling latency actually is. So in this case right here, DB01, I got 8 CPUs. My measurements here are number of milliseconds spent in the scheduling queue per vCPU per VM per polling period. Polling period default in VMware is 20 seconds. So if you look 31, 34, 25, 27, 27, 35, 26, 35. So, what does that mean? That's the interesting thing. So let me show you a little bit of math here. Now this is the real-time view. I'm going to open calculator. Let's pick the biggest one on the screen there, 34. So if we go 34, that's milliseconds, divided by 20,000 milliseconds in that polling interval, multiply it by 100%. What that gives me is a 0.17% performance penalty on that vCPU on that polling interval. That's nothing. That's absolutely nothing. That is CPU scheduling and its performance impact. This is why when a lot of folks say do one vCPU to every physical core and don't go beyond that, I laugh because it might be wasting resources. Now, if you got a really busy machine, yeah, one-to-one might be advisable, and one-to-one is a very safe starting point. But I would claim you do the math here, you can actually get greater than one-to-one and still maintain your performance. Because a 0.17% performance hit, yeah, we got plenty of headroom on there.
Okay. All right, we have another question a couple of them that I put out to you in your chat window. So do the backups we make on the VM disk, the BAK and the TRN files, still get backed up with an app aware disabled?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They definitely do because those are already written to disk and they're basically just sitting there. It's not an I/O that's pending inside Windows. So whatever you write there, as long as they are actually doing the VM level backup properly, and again, always, 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 never ever trust your backups, trust your restores. Restore it. The cool thing with VMs, you can actually restore it to another VM in a secondary network. Fire it up. You don't need to change machine name or IP addresses or anything. Just make sure that that network can't talk to production. You can fire this up and test it, but that way you can go in and test. And if they're doing it right, everything that you write to the file system is going to get backed up just fine.
Okay. And then if you use SQL Server with 2 CPUs in VMware, should you then also set the NUMA down to 2? Host has 2 CPUs with 4 cores.
That's tough. It's one of those things. This is one of those where I want you to test with your workload and your environment to see if it's going to make a difference for you. My personal preference with the workloads that I manage is I usually don't extend NUMA into the VM until I hit 6 or more virtual CPUs. And it's more of a matter of workload and preference, and you got to test it to see what matters. But usually I find that below 6, I really don't get a performance improvement there. In fact, I might actually get a small performance penalty from SQL Server trying to deal with NUMA scheduling overhead. Your workload at the 6 to 8 mark, it kind of varies. You'll want to test it. Beyond 8, VMware and Hyper-V do it by default. You definitely want to balance it with the physical machine, unless you've got 12 cores or more on each chip. And watch your CPU architecture. AMD chips, when they say they have 16 cores, it's actually 2 by 8, and it treats it as separate NUMA nodes. So what you can get is this ready time values here. Even if the VM is set to fit inside of one of those 16 CPU profiles, you may actually get really, really elevated ready and co-stop times as a result of that architecture.
And David, I want to bring up something that yesterday I was having a conversation as we were beginning to move a SQL Server to a new box, new VM box. And by the way, guys, we're total virtual in ours. So if you're afraid of it, don't be afraid. I've had up to a 700 gig database on a VM, so it performs just fine. But yeah, yesterday he was like, we were setting that up, and he was giving me the 64 gigs of memory, and then we were talking about vCPUs. Now, in our particular shop, we're fairly small, so we don't license at the VM host level because we don't have enough VMs to do that in the production environment. We actually license at each guest. So he was like going, in the production server, he was like going, well, let me give you 6 vCPUs. And he's going, oh, no, 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 let me give you 8 vCPUs because Microsoft sells the license at 4 CPU intervals. So I just thought that was a interesting thing. So if you're licensing at the guest level, why would you only give yourself 6 when you got to buy 8 or buy 4 in 4 packets?
Well, I would say if you don't need 8, you can see right here, you still have additional CPUs that you have to schedule, even if they're not actually being used.
Right.
And if you've got 8 and you only need 6, the drag of having those extra ones to schedule might actually boost the ready times here and slow you down a little bit.
Really? Okay.
Yep.
Interesting. Interesting. I'll have to talk to him about that. But
Yeah, it's one, if you're using all 8, that's a different story. But, if you're not, yeah, I would dial it back a little bit.
yeah, I'll definitely have to have him or look at that and see what it's doing to me. So that's interesting. Okay. Next question we have, I just posted up to you, and he's asking a little bit about solar wind, so that's going to may or may not be able to answer that, but I'll let you go ahead and read that one since it's pretty long.
This is a good one. Somebody has SolarWinds to monitor the database instance, and one of the counters is signal weights going up to 40% overall, but the actual VM vCPU utilization is under 10%, but the host is over 80%. So they're not sure what the signal weight percentage could be real or could be an indication of something else. And this is one we'd want to dive in a little bit further on. Essentially, if I've got signal weights that are high, but the VM CPU utilization is low, it could mean that the host, this ready time that we're looking at right here, could be so high that the SQL Server just can't execute fast enough, so the CPU consumption is low, and as a result, SQL Server is waiting on CPU because it doesn't know about the hypervisor. If the host is over 80% utilization on CPU, I would really double check these ready times. So to go back to the original question, my personal threshold here is in the 3 to 400 range as kind of a yellow line, and a 5 to 600 range per vCPU, not the cumulative counter, but per vCPU. That's kind of my high water mark. And what that gives you is about a 3 to 4% performance penalty per CPU. Now the way it actually adds up with SQL Server and the way it parallelizes, I claim that if you take that measurement, double it, and that's about the net impact that SQL Server is seeing. So 3 to 4% there generally translates to anywhere from a 6 to a 9% performance penalty on the SQL Server itself, and that's as the application sees it. And because it's really all about not having the end users yell and scream when things are running slow. Generally speaking, they start to notice when you have about a 10% performance hit on any given task. So you keep these numbers down, you can keep that scheduling impact down.
Okay. All right. And that looks like all of our questions at this moment. If anybody else has any questions, go ahead and submit them and we'll get them answered for you. And David, I sent one to you, kind of sent, to batter back and forth a little discussion of why do people not virtualize? What's the fear? What are you hearing out there when and what's your response to them of how you're able to overcome the fear of not putting a SQL Server on bare metal versus on VMware
A
or
bunch of
another
reasons.
one? Okay.
Yeah, a bunch of reasons. And first and foremost, how many times have you gotten burned by something in the past, and to this day you still do something a certain way because you got burned by it a while back? It happens. I still do things when I build VMs, as a result of getting burned, 8 and 10 years ago, the infancy of virtualization. A lot of times people don't do it because they got burned by it 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, and that memory is still there, or the fear in the organization is there. They don't want to go through another performance problem or whatever they had from times past, and they hesitate. Other reasons can be, the licensing aspect that you talked about. It can potentially change when you virtualize. I claim that if you've got a moderate scale of database engines, you might be able to save money with licensing, or at least break even on it. But other cases, not so much. So it could add up there. Other times, it could just be that the organization, as an infrastructure perspective, just aren't ready for it. They may have big machines that are physical. The virtual environment may be designed for maximum consolidation and not necessarily performance, and that can get you there. You don't want to just lift and drop something if the performance is going to be cut in half. So you've got all that. You've got a number of reasons. Fear, performance, licensing. Another one is, what if the application vendor says we will not support it when it's virtual? Now this is getting better over time, but it's still out there, and it stinks. It's really tough to deal with when they say, we don't support virtualization. A lot of times they may actually want to void your warranty, on the app as a result, and that's poor on their part, but it happens. Now the talking points on that one are easy. It's let me build a virtual copy of this, and then you as a business step back and do your validation. And usually this works because they just haven't had the experience or the time in-house to do it themselves. If you offer to do it for them, usually they open up, and at the end of that process, it will change their mind, and usually they're going to be okay with it. Now there's some other database vendors out there. They're a little more contentious with that. SQL Server is really good about that. A lot of the third-party vendors for different apps are fine with it. But for example, there was one I did a while back. It was a medical ERP translation system between different devices, and they wanted to ship a physical machine, and they swore that it would not run in a VM, and that the physical machine had to have 32 cores and 128 gigs of RAM, and it was just this overbuilt machine. And we talked them into letting us do a proof of concept in a VM. Come to find out, it had a 1.5 gig memory footprint, and it needed 2 CPUs.
Wow.
Yeah, they just had no idea the characteristics of their app, so they're forcing all these little hospitals out there to buy this big server for something that honestly could have run on my cell phone.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot of times, we don't know. I think that's part of the fear too, is, especially if it's bare metal now, is, it's like, how do I get the IOPS? How do I get how much CPU it's using, and et cetera, before I do put it virtual? And another question for you, David, have you actually, what's your opinion of Azure VM and AWS VMs and stuff like that? Have you started putting anything up there, or are you really staying more with down with VMware and Hyper-V and stuff like that?
Oh, I've been actively working on both public cloud platforms. I really like Azure a lot. Amazon they kind of started the rush, I think, with SQL Server in the cloud. Microsoft picked up, quickly, and I claim that it's my, I've got a number of internal projects already out there. I love it. The performance and the availability are what can get you. You got to pay for the performance, and right now the availability is still a little lower than what some organizations can live with. The application needs to be able to handle very, very small, outages while the thing moves around in the back end. But if it's the right use case, I claim public cloud is a great way to go, especially Azure.
Yeah, it's I was just looking at the other day, the SQL Azure DB, the stuff they've added to it for version 12, and it's getting pretty close to where I could actually move my databases out to the cloud without losing any functionality. So getting
Yeah,
pretty close.
the biggest thing that I still need is a job scheduler, but I know there's workarounds for that. Once I
Yeah.
use it for a number of things. I've got some data collectors already out there, and I've actually got plans for one of the elastic scale databases that is going to need a pretty big performance footprint here pretty soon.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. The biggest drawback right now for me is not having SQL Agent. Because there's a lot of things, a lot of tasks that I drive that way, and I haven't found a real good way yet to get around that particular issue. So
Yeah, there's another good question here about recommend a good VM getting started book, and there's a few here. The number one book that I like, and it says VMware, but it really applies all over the place, is this one, Virtualizing SQL Server with VMware by Michael Corey, Jeff Stastak, and Michael Webster. I think it's a great book. If you get rid of some of the TLAs and the buzzwords, it really applies to any local private cloud hypervisor that you've got. The book was built for VM admins, so you may need a little bit of help translating some of the infrastructure speak in there, but they do a great job discussing HA, DR, performance, things like that. I love it. Outside of that, if you're looking for just a general ramp up on virtualization, there's two. There's a really good book on Hyper-V by a gentleman by the name of Aiden Finn. It's out at Amazon. And there's also another one called Mastering VMware vSphere 6.0. Both of those are really good intro books to get started with virtualization. I love them both.
Cool. Okay. All right. We've got some more coming in here. See if I can actually paste this one into you. It's kind of a long one also, David. So we'll give David a moment to read that.
That's a good one too. Man, these are great. Okay, question, and I'll paraphrase here. These are virtual machines that they have slow performance. These servers have very little memory available, and there's a memory counter inside Windows called free memory. There's a lot of memory called standby. A restart frees up standby and frees up free. It's interesting. Could the memory with the status of standby be used or locked on the other VMware guests in their environment? And that's a good question. When it needs, yeah. In essence, not really. What that standby memory counter is, it's essentially memory that Windows has targeted as kind of stale, and it's there, and it could reclaim that and reuse it for something else if needed. Otherwise, it's just sort of hanging out. Now, we got that 100 to 200 meg free counter, and it's on the low side of good. Generally speaking, I don't like to see less than 200 or 300 megs of free memory at any given point in time. When you drop below, and I think the threshold is 90 megs of free RAM, Windows will actually kick off a process that tells all active running processes to give back some memory. And I think when it hits 140 or 150 megs free, then it issues a command, okay, we're good. What happens is if the free memory status gets low, it can actually flip-flop between those two states, and the processes can be like, I got to get back memory right now. Okay, we're good. Now I'm going to grab all that I can. Oh, no, I got to give some back. Okay, now I can give it all, or I can take it all again. If you manage that, and I would take SQL Server and I would reduce a buffer pool by just a couple hundred megs there, just to give that little bit of extra headroom inside Windows. You'll be okay. You don't have to worry about paging inside Windows from that point. The standby services there, that's a little bit different. The last part of the question was, if the virtualization layer has to swap memory from another guest, what you'll actually find is that the ballooning driver expands, and you'll see it's like memctl.exe or something. You'll see that's actually going in and growing its memory footprint, and it would actually take memory from the standby block, but it's at that point, it's going to hurt you no matter what. So I would talk to the VM admins and get those hosts out of the memory pressure state that they're in first and foremost.
Okay, and we don't have any more questions at this point. If you have a question, go ahead and post it up, and we will actually get David to answer it. And there comes one now. So let me post it over to David. It says, I am running into a WMI error that only happens at 8:02 p.m. on different servers nightly. I'm trying to figure out why in my VM is causing this error. This is showing up on Spotlight Monitoring Tool. I do not see this error on my physical box.
What is the specific error?
Yeah, we'll have to get him to kind of hit us up and tell us
Yeah,
what it is.
if it's a WMI error, it might be from a background process that's being triggered externally, like a backup or antivirus scan or some routine sysadmin process. Um, it's yeah, it could be a number of different things, but since it's cyclic like that, that's a good sign. It means you'll be able to track it down a little bit easier. If we can see that WMI error code, oh boy, give me one
Yeah, no,
second.
he's given us an error code, so that was might take a little bit of googling to figure that one out there. So
RPC server is unavailable. Aha. Well, it might be one. Hang on. Let me check. Okay. Microsoft KB is saying RPC server is unavailable. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. Here's a theory. I don't want to say this is it or not. My gut tells me something's going on with backups somewhere along the line. So either we've got some kind of a link server or a call from this machine out to another one, and that machine may be going down or may be having a problem with the backups where, like, if it does a VM level backup and a snapshot goes to release, it could actually pause that VM for a second or two, and that could cause this. It could be with another machine that this one is linked to somehow, and that one goes offline very, very briefly. But what I would do first and foremost, I would check your VM level backup schedule and see what is lining up in there with this exact time slice.
he must have come in a little bit late because I just posted to you his follow-up comment.
There it is, VSS snapshots.
VSS
Yep.
snapshots. We were talking about that at the very beginning, that in my shop we was having IO frozen and IO restore. Look at your SQL Server error log. You know, you need to turn that off.
Yep.
So,
And this is another symptom of a VSS problem. It's a little bit different from the storage one, but what can happen is if the VSS snapshots are running, it could actually hit Windows so hard and be so intensive that it could actually cause the network to just pause very briefly, but just enough to throw that error.
all right. And then there's your next question, if you want to take a moment to read it there.
Okay. Have a guest on a host. Performance monitor counts for the disks shows that the storage performance is horrible. On the SAN, 1 millisecond and below. That's another really good question. I actually wrote 2 proposals yesterday to investigate this exact scenario.
I actually think I see that in my shop. You know, they're telling me the sand's running fine, but when I'm looking at Spotlight and stuff, it's saying its latency is horrible.
Yep.
So go ahead,
Yep.
David.
There's a number of things to do here. First and foremost, what you want to do is to figure out everything that's between your VM and that SAN. So if it's a blade, then you've got a blade chassis, you've got mezzanine, HBA, or network adapters. If it's a physical machine, just standalone rack mount server, you got HBAs or the NICs that way. You've got any number of switches in between that physical machine and that server. So it could be fiber channel over Ethernet, could be Ethernet, could be fiber. All of these should have the ability to go look at the ports in between them. Usually what I find here is that one of those pieces is either misconfigured or with a bottleneck. And this is the tough part. It's really hard to pinpoint a lot of these. The interesting thing there is they could be bottlenecked in terms of raw throughput, or with fiber especially. There's this construct called fiber queuing, and the terminology they use is queue depth. So think of it kind of like a fire hose with a straw at the other end. You end up with kind of this back pressure wave from the point where those two meet, along the fire hose portion. What I see a lot of is that it's been a problem for a long time, but it's not really come out until the SAN itself is so fast that it kind of exposes this other bottleneck. What you're going to want to make sure is have them do a fiber channel HBA queue depth analysis along each piece there. what you may find is that the queue depth on the SAN is set lower than the switches, which may in fact be lower than the physical machine. So that means a physical machine may be trying to send more I/O than the switches or the SAN can handle, and it results in the SAN basically being idle and the VM and the physical machine showing really high latencies. So I would start there.
Yeah, I've actually, at my old company, we upgraded one time to a new version of SQL Server and put it on VM and stuff, and a new SAN, and we were so fast that we basically killed our uh, throughput out to the internet. We actually had to have them open our pipe up more because we were pushing so much data that it could not keep up. So.
Yep, yep. Now, if the SAN is reporting idle, I would claim there's a bottleneck. If the SAN is showing really, really busy, it's a different story altogether. And someone made a
Right.
great comment from the SQL Server free memory question. Search for great SQL Server debates lock pages. And there's going to be a lot of details in that article about memory allocations.
All right. And the questions are coming, so I'm just keeping
Oh,
posting them for you and let you continue.
there's another really good question about running SQL Server on hyperconverged solutions such as Nutanix or SimpliVity. And things about virtual storage controllers and Flash and spindles and all that. I claim that the hyperconverged solutions are fantastic. I've got a lot of experience with both Nutanix and SimpliVity. I actually wrote SimpliVity's reference architecture for SQL Server on the OmniCube platform. I really like them. They are wonderful. The only challenge there is these things do replication of the storage under the hood. If you're doing SQL Server data movement, so a lot of ETL or even availability groups or transactional replication, you're kind of replicating the data 2 times. So one thing to keep an eye on is just those throughput values. Most of the time, you're just not going to have an issue, and these things perform really, really well.
Okay.
Okay, so the next question here is, there's an actual question to, is that you or is it somebody else?
No, I think actual question for me, some DBAs have spoken speak poorly of VMotion relative to SQL Server. I am thinking they're doing it wrong. What are your thoughts on VMotion relative to SQL Server?
Good question. VMotion done right will not cause a problem on non-clustered SQL servers, period.
Non-clustered.
Asterisk.
Yeah, you put a caveat in there, David.
Uh-huh.
Non-clustered.
Well, so non-clustered, you shouldn't have an issue if the environment is built and configured properly. If there are things such as older network switches or hosts that are overwhelmed, what you may find is that the time that it takes for the vMotion to complete, specifically that last little bit of the movement, you may actually find that the SQL Server would go offline for 1 or 2 seconds. That's not good, but these are things that can be worked around through better network switching or just watching and reducing or even prioritizing the load on the SQL Server side or on the VM side. If it takes more than 1/4 of a second of a slowdown for the vMotion to end and that SQL Server performance to take that tiny hit, then something's wrong. So therefore, I claim you're good. Now, clustered, you're going to want to reduce the cluster thresholds there, especially if you're doing, say, availability groups where you don't have shared storage. If you do have shared storage, your mileage may vary on what's supported and what's not, depending on the platform and the version. I claim that if it's clustered with traditional shared storage, you probably don't want to vMotion it, even if it's supported, unless you really have to.
Now you really came up and brought up a point that I want to kind of make sure you differentiate. When I hear the word cluster, I'm thinking a failover cluster instance to where I have 2 nodes and I have shared storage, right? So you also brought up availability groups, which of course uses the clustering technology, are you saying both of them have the potential issues?
The ones with shared storage will be susceptible to it more than the ones without shared storage. The ones with shared storage will feel it faster. The other one, if AG's non-clustered, what you'll find is that you may trigger an AG failover if that VMotion takes too long.
Right.
But again, if you reduce the thresholds there just a little bit, you won't have a problem. You shouldn't have a problem anyway.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Cool.
Someone asked you to repeat your book, that one that if you could bring that screenshot back up while I post some other things of the book you recommended for someone new, because they were like, they did not find that book. So.
Yep, right there. Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V Installation and Configuration Guide by Aidan Finn. I don't know if this has been updated for R2 or not, but it's still a really good book. Another one is Mastering Windows Server 2012 R2, Mark Benassi, a bunch of other authors. This one covers Windows as well as the Hyper-V role inside it. It just does a really good job with it.
Okay. I'm posting a couple more in there too. You've got one of them, and here comes another one. So.
Okay, so there's somebody with a SQL Server failover cluster, one node on a VMware platform and the other is physical. Is this a bad setup, and somewhere is that documented? I'll be the first to tell you that's not a bad setup at all. It's a great way to get into clustering with virtualization. I would claim that eventually that physical machine is going to retire, and I would say make it full bore virtual, on all virtual. But what you've got, I think it's a great setup. To me, it's a really solid way to kind of help bridge that gap and to set yourself up for full virtualization down the road. As far as documentation for that, there's not a lot out there that I know of about the hybrid failover cluster instance configuration with that. But if you send me an email, I will look for you.
Okay, and there's some more in there for you there.
Okay. Another question, when you P to V a failover cluster, are there any items to be aware of during the process, heartbeat, etc.? First and foremost, I don't like to do a P to V operation itself where you just pick a physical machine, convert it to virtual for failover clusters. I generally would want to do an instance migration at that point. Once you are virtual, there are things to be aware of. I would want a dedicated network stream, be it virtualization networking port group, hopefully even a private virtual LAN, VLAN, for the heartbeat communication there, and that way you can ensure that it gets there as fast as possible with the least amount of background activity, and you can even prioritize it at the switch level.
Okay, and back to the snapshot. I didn't catch? He was asking. We talked about the VSS and the snapshot. He's asking, can we turn around and do some? What are we recommending as an alternative there?
That's another good one. Part of it is I just have a tough time trusting VSS by most backup agents. You want to test it, you want to verify that it works for you. If it doesn't work in your environment, what I would do is do a two-part backup and restore process. You want to back up the VM itself, but as part of the process, know that you're probably going to need to do a SQL Server level restore of last night's full database backup, or diff, or however you do it, plus apply the transaction logs. So if you manage the backups and the transaction logs separately, and hopefully even back them up and get them off of that machine frequently, you'll be able to do two parts for a restore, not have to deal with VSS, and everything will still be consistent.
Okay. And then
let's see. One more question here. An additional caveat for clustering, it's a good point somebody brings up here. You want to set up a it's failover clustering or AGs, however you want to do it. You want to set up a VM to VM affinity so that they cannot live on the same host together. We do that as a result of, if one host were to fail, motherboard goes out or something, you don't want to lose both cluster nodes. And I can actually show you this here. Can you still see my screen?
Yeah, we still have it.
Okay, so I even did this here just for domain controllers. So rules, separate domain controllers. Let's zoom in here. And in this case, all I say is those two VMs should not live on the same host. Simple as that. And that way, if a host were to fail, I lose one, I don't lose both. Now, if you're in a blade environment, this gets even more interesting because what you need to do is work with your VM admins to identify what hosts live on what blade chassis. And if you've got that kind of scale, you even want to do that with those. You want to say VMs, these are the set of VMs, should not live with another set of VMs on the same blade chassis because chassis can fail as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've seen a chassis actually fail, and stuff. So.
Ooh, one good question here. A person sysadmin says we don't need a cluster because the VM handles the failover. Ah, man, I could go on for about 2 hours on that question. And I always bring it back to this. We need to separate planned failure from an unplanned failure, and we need to separate unplanned failures from routine maintenance. So from an unplanned failure standpoint, if a host were to fail, if it's a single instance VM, the VM dies. It's just gone. And the agents on the back end detect the outage, and it'll actually restart that VM on another host that's still up and running. Well, on average, it's about a 2-minute, 45-second to 4-minute operation to let Windows start back up and let SQL Server go through crash recovery. If your infrastructure, if your business can withstand that kind of an impact, fine. Don't add the extra complexity in there unless you need it. But a lot of the organizations that I work with have SLAs that are tighter than that. And those, that VM level HA just isn't good enough. I claim it can now complement what SQL Server can already do well. So failover clusters, mirroring, and then AGs. Those things can have a much lower, basically time to recover than a VM level HA. The flip side of that is, what if I want to apply a service pack and I go to put that on a single instance? Well, that thing's down until it's done. That could take half an hour, however long it takes. What if you don't have the maintenance windows for that? That's not good. So if you're doing one of the SQL Server level HA solutions, you can just patch the secondary node, do a quick failover, patch the primary node, and you're done, and there's very little outage. So, it all depends on what your organization needs and what the business apps needs, but the sysadmin doesn't understand what it's like to be a DBA. They don't understand that need for 24/7 operations, planned or unplanned. And so go back to them with those talking points and see what they say. And then meet in the middle, look at the business and say, the business needs this. VM level HA can or cannot do that, and if not, these are the other options that we need to explore.
All right, David. Well, we're out of time. I was going to talk to you a moment, but we'll let these guys go. Again, it's been a pleasure, guys. You've done a great job, especially in the comments. Let me know if you want more questions and answers. We try to do this at least a couple times a year, and we can answer your questions with what's going on. It's a lot of times it's even better than a presentation because you get a lot more information. So definitely appreciate it.
It's a lot of fun. Yeah, there's one last question in there about specific recommendations for a VMware book, and right there, Mastering VMware vSphere 6.
There you go, guys. There you go. So
Awesome.
Today, our winner of the $100 gift card is going to be Aaron Giles. Aaron Giles, I will send you an email to verify your address, and you're the winner of the $100 Amazon gift card today. So,
sweet, congrats.
Yeah, congrats. Yeah, definitely. And David, it's our pleasure again to have you. We'll get this lined up again, maybe late summertime, do another one of these, or if you come up with another topic you want to do, just let us know, and we'll be glad to have you here again.
Awesome.
Remember, next month we're having Scott Shaw on big data and VMware, so we'll see what he has to say. Both Dave and I were talking about it earlier, and basically saying, 6 months ago he said no way, and at Summit in November he's now saying yes. So we want to know, why did he change his mind? So
Yep, I'll be tuned in.
yeah, all right, David. Thanks again, and thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Cool. Thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. And email me if you have any other questions.
Will do.
Cool.
Bye bye.
Bye now.